Grace and peace to you in the name of Jesus Christ. This is Pastors for Pastors, the podcast that supports and celebrates pastors of all churches and denominations. I'm Ken Broman Folks, your host, and I'm so pleased to share this week's podcast with you. It's the second of a two-part exploration into what it's like to be a clergy couple, where both spouses are actively engaged in pastoral ministry. Last week, we talked with Jay and Erin Bowers, who serve two congregations in two different denominations. This week, we talk about what it's like to share the same position in the same church as co-senior pastors of a busy 700-member congregation. The Reverends Josh and Lara Musser serve the First Presbyterian Church of Salisbury, North Carolina, as co-heads of staff, splitting the responsibilities of that position between the two of them. As a head of staff for many years, there were countless times I wished there were two of me to handle the multitude of responsibilities of that position. But along with the joys, there are some challenges for a married couple who also work so closely together. I'm going to let Laura and Josh share some of those joys and challenges with you. I can't wait for you to meet this delightful couple. So let's jump right in. So I do want to thank you both for your willingness to sit down and chat with me about the whole idea of clergy couples. This is a new phenomenon for me, and I think for a lot of people, and it's a very interesting phenomenon. And so I'm looking forward to talking with you about it. So first of all, tell me how the two of you met. My intuition is that you probably met in seminary, because it'd be a really interesting story if you met before then and then both went to seminary. But tell me how you all met.
Go ahead, Lara. That's actually it. So you can start us off.
Okay. We did meet before seminary. We met in college. We're both Midwesterners. Josh is from Michigan. I'm from Illinois. But we happened to both go to college in Seattle. And we met in a class called Women in Christianity. And it was probably 2/3 women in the class, and Josh was one of the few men who were in the class, and I had my eye on him, and we started dating in college.
We actually, Lara went to a summer camp, a Presbyterian summer camp in Saugatuck, Michigan for years. And that camp is 15 minutes from where I grew up, near Lake Michigan, on the shore of Lake Michigan. So I always tell people that we decided to fly 3,000 miles as far from home as possible to go to college to meet and marry somebody who grew up 2 hours. So it's pretty remarkable.
That's amazing. And so you met in college, and at that time, were you both looking to become ministers?
I went to SVU thinking I was going to be a nurse, and very quickly after like a B- in chemistry, was like, I don't think I'm supposed to be a nurse. And then started studying scripture and theology. So I would say in college, I knew that my vocation involved reading, studying, and teaching the Bible. I did not know in which way that would be expressed.
For me, the writing was probably always on the wall, but I really did not put ordained congregational ministry I did not put that together, that was my calling, probably until I got to seminary. I thought maybe in seminary, I went to seminary thinking maybe I'll go and do professorship or something. And very quickly into seminary, realized, no, I want to do congregational ministry.
So where in this process did you get married? Were you married when you went to seminary, or how did that all work?
We were leaving Seattle. We applied to seminary together while we were engaged. We each took a little time off after college to live our lives and then apply to seminary. So we were engaged. And then we left Seattle in June of 2013, got married in the Midwest in July, and started seminary at Duke in August of that year. So we were newlyweds in seminary.
We decided to stack up all of the most stressful life transitions into about 2 months. So we've done that several times now.
What are some of the other ones?
I mean, this story may come as an answer to a later question, but we had both applied to be co-youth ministers at a church in Seattle. That was a church we had both been sort of a part of. I was under care with that church in seminary. They were kind of my people. We were under care with Seattle Presbyterian, and we got to the finals and really thought it was it. Had friends on the committee, and it didn't work out. It kind of crushed us, and that was sort of our whole plan, was back to the Northwest we go. So then it was like a blank slate, and it was like, if whatever we can find. So there was this residency in Greensboro, first Greensboro, and there was one position, and we both shot out applications. Just were like, maybe one of us will get this thing, and the other person will be a bartender. I don't know, sling coffee at Starbucks or whatever. And then we ended up being the two finalists with one other person, and then they ended up offering two positions to us both. So that was kind of the launching of clergy couple working in the same place. So that gave us 2 years to do ministry together as a couple, which was really significant.
Which was interesting because I grew up with co-pastors who were married. So Reverend Deb and Clinton Roberts, shout out to them. They were big mentors to us, but I knew that working together as a clergy couple is so rare, and things just really have to align. And so we really were never expecting that to really be our path. Not that we didn't have an interest in it, but just that we were realistic about what was possible.
Not that many openings for that, right?
No. Well, you got to find a church that's ready to hire two at the same time, which is just, or a PNC that just has imagination beyond what you could expect. And so Greensboro taking both of us at the same time was such a gift. It let us both get started in ordained ministry and let us figure out some of our identity as ministers separately, because we didn't do everything together, but we did at that call build up a young adult ministry program. So we got to practice working together a little.
So did you come to Salisbury from that position, or? Okay.
We did. Yeah, we again, two people, I'm sure the other clergy couples you'll interview have similar things of when it's time to launch into the next thing. You just both are hoping one can find something and hope that it works for the other person too. And we talked to a lot of clergy couples who said, you often end up taking turns. My turn for this call, the next call, your turn. We made an Excel document with every realistic opening in the country off the CLC, which is the Presbyterian, we call it online dating for pastors and churches. So we were applying all over the country. We were applying in California and Washington and Illinois. And then first Salisbury, we actually knew that position was open, but we didn't even consider applying. We were like, we just think it might be a long shot. And then someone we worked with, one of the young adults in Greensboro, Facebook messaged the chair of the PNC here without knowing that he was the chair of the PNC, telling him about us. And so that kind of put us on their radar, and then we started talking to them from there.
So they weren't looking for co-pastors.
No, and I would argue that pretty much no one ever is.
Yeah.
I think they stumbled upon us, and I think throughout the whole process we were all like, this is different. Let's see what the Spirit does. And I think a lot of the gifts, I think me and Lara and the church have, along the journey of after the call, learned the gift of co-pastors. I think there are things that we've discovered and they've discovered. We're like, oh wow, yeah, this is really it. This is really great. But, to pump up Lara for a moment, I mean, she's the first woman in this church's history. There's this back history room that I affectionately call the Wall of White Men. And,
yes. Every church has one of those.
And, every church has one. And it's, I mean, that's not a derogatory comment, and they've been faithful ministers. But Lara will be the first woman on that wall, and we'll be the first couple on that wall, and I think the first non-Southern borners on the first Yankees on that wall. And so there's a new. It was a PNC with a large imagination that I would say was being given to them by the Spirit. But it was a pretty amazing process with them, and it just fit. It worked the whole way.
Well, kudos to First Salisbury for being open to that and being willing to think outside the box and being led by the Spirit to consider something that certainly was not in their tradition, nor is it in most Presbyterian church traditions.
We haven't told this story of getting called here in a while, and so it's really fun to retell, because it was so the Holy Spirit making the way. And with that call that we thought we had in the bag out in Seattle after seminary, we kind of learned the hard way that you can't plan what the Holy Spirit's going to do. And this PNC, they had not been able to find unity over, I think they did 120 PIFs by the end, and they were not unanimous about a single one until we came along, and we're just like totally out of the box.
And they were unanimous about that. That really is impressive.
That was so evidence of the Spirit, and I think the church has been we've been blessed by it, and I think the church has been blessed by it.
How do you divide that up? How does that work?
So when we were talking to the PNC initially, we made a chart of who will do which committee. Clarity was so important as we went through that process, because people do not want two people doing one job and it feeling like a bottleneck, or who do I go to when? So we share certain committees, but then we've broken it up. So one of the ways that this church was able to imagine into having calling co-pastors is they were also looking for a youth position. That has been added into what we do. So Josh leads that charge. He's amazing with the young people. And then we split up the other committees, but we're both heads of staff. We each supervise certain people on our staff, and we take turns preaching. So every other week, one of us is preaching. We alternate moderating session. So we really are partners in, especially the leadership of the church. There's really no place in that part of direction giving or moderating that one of us is more on that than the other.
You need to have that clarity so that you're not saying conflicting or opposite things to people.
Yeah, absolutely. And we came in as people who had been ministry and residents for 2 years with a chart saying this is how it will go, and then it got blown up. But you continually, as fluid as ministry is, which it is, it's not a rigid thing, it's a very dynamic thing. Our roles have shifted and changed, and certainly with the pandemic, figuring out how our roles would be expressed. But one way to try to combat burnout in ministry is to do what you love. And so you have to figure that out too, and figure out what you love. And that's different for Lara and I. Lara and I are not the same pastor, but we agree on what pastoring is. Like, what is it that we're actually trying to do? Why are we doing this thing called ministry? What's the point? I think we really agree on what that is. And if you agree on that, and you have the dynamics as a couple where you can be co-workers and a couple, can really fit into place pretty well.
Let's talk about the blessings and the curses. What are the joys and the struggles of being co-workers and to a great extent filling a very similar position in the eyes of your congregation?
Well, there's a lot of blessings, and then some very real burdens in it. One is that neither of us have the full burden of preaching, and so getting that every other week rhythm enables us to each stay fresh and carry on and try to remain creative in preaching. And that creativity that is required, it's hard to keep it going. So having that week off to decompress and study is a huge blessing. Probably the biggest burden is just the temptation to talk about ministry at home. When we first started, we really had to be very careful not to start doing the calendar while we were laying in bed, or even now, especially with the pandemic, we're both working at home most of the time. Now we've gone back into the office a little, but we're at home mostly. And so it's really easy to start processing that last meeting at 7 p.m. Because we can just accidentally fall into having a meeting over dinner.
Yeah. How quickly a dinner becomes the head of staff's meeting, or date night or something, It's like,
boy, that's romantic. Let's go out to dinner and talk about church.
Right. Let's talk about that new mission fund.
Stewardship.
I think that the minister vocation is such a deeply personal thing. I mean, I think modern society tries to separate and dichotomize professional life, home life, all of that stuff. And I don't think that's possible as human beings to do that, but we try to do that. You can't do that as a pastor fully. I mean, you create boundaries, but it's such a deeply personal thing to be called. And I think also as people, the things that are often, I've learned this in counseling, the things that are greatest about you can often be the places where there are also deep wounds. And so a blessing is, as personal as ministry is, you have this other person who, by virtue of being committed to you for life and joining to you in marriage, is also joined to all of that stuff that's underneath you. When you get into ministry, you get down into the deeper stuff, especially in the pandemic, and you really you look at yourself, and on some Sundays you're like, do I have a word to say to these people? And you're like, I don't know. And on Saturday night, I have a pillow right next to me with Lara's head on it where I can say, I don't think I have a word. And she can say, yeah, you do, because God is still God. And that means it's less lonely for us. I think Lara and I, we're still lonely. I mean, because being a pastor means getting, God literally taking your roots and just throwing them asunder and throwing them somewhere else. But we have each other. And that, I think that's a profound gift. But that also means, as a curse, that somebody is really close in your business, and ministry hits really close to home for each of us in different ways. And sometimes it's too close. Like sometimes having someone that close to seeing your pastoral failings, or your I'm so close to burnout, I'm one more email critique away from quitting, or whatever. It's someone that close. That's tough. That's not easy. And to get really real about it, I think we've spent our entire marriage being in a position where people are watching us both do the same job. And it's impossible for comparison and competition and jealousy to not get in there sometimes. And this has been a conversation. Our premarital counselor had us look at each other in a room and say, I'm going to throw out a word and you have to talk about it. And the first word he said was competition. How are you going to go home with different GPAs and talk to your family? How are you going to do it? And we were like, oh gosh, I don't know.
And the first time, Josh is a stellar student. I'm a good student. Josh is a stellar student. And the first time we came home and he had a better GPA than me, it was tough, but it was a great learning experience for us to practice. Okay, it doesn't mean we're always going to do it the exact same way. We have to be open to being different, and that being the gift we bring to this ministry is our difference.
First of all, Josh, what you said about a call being such a personal thing, I love that, because that's so true. And the loneliness, and it's really interesting to hear you say that even when your pastor is your mate for life, that there's still a loneliness, because it's so deeply personal, where God calls you out of everything else to make this your priority. But also, I was going to ask about the competition and the comparison and how you deal with, there's no way a congregation cannot say, oh, well, so-and-so is a better preacher. I really like coming on the Sundays they preach, or I wish so-and-so was moderating our, or resourcing our committee. How do you deal with that?
Well, I think one of the gifts for us is my experience growing up with a married co-pastor model, because the two of them were so different. And so I grew up always knowing, well, Deb is really out of the box and creative, and Clinton's very steady and administrative. And so for us, but over time, you just realize they're different people with different gifts, and we need both of those. Our first year, where we were getting through the firsts, so I preached the first Sunday, I preached the first Christmas. That was a little bit intentional with me being the first woman senior pastor. I have the slightly bigger office, just to make sure that people understood that I wasn't, the helper or associate to Josh's senior. Which actually the charge at our installation was done by a minister in our Presbyterian who came up through this church, and she kind of called that out directly right away. She said, you guys need to understand that they are co-pastors. Lara is not the assistant or associate or helper. And I was mortified at the time, but she was absolutely right to just kind of name that early on and get it out of the way, because the church has not had a problem with it. They've been wonderful. So that first year where people were getting to know us, we really had to trust that over time they will see us for our unique gifts and as partners, knowing they need both of us. But when Josh preached Easter and I hadn't gotten to do an Easter yet, of course, that little insecurity comes up and says, oh gosh, I'll never be able to preach an Easter that good. And they'll just say they want Josh for Easter, or vice versa for Christmas. And so I think time has softened that insecurity. And then sometimes, one of us hits it out of the park, and we can celebrate that person. And then if you drop the ball on something, that the partner is there to comfort and say, this doesn't define you. From what I can tell from our church, though, they do not compare. They haven't compared us to our face very much yet. We try not to advertise who's preaching, just in case that someone gets a following, because that just helps. But otherwise, I think people almost appreciate the yin and yang that we bring.
What I was going to say to your original question of how do you deal with a competition was, well, counseling and a spiritual director. But
that's true too.
One of the sweet parts, as much as there are critical voices in ministry, etc., people do eventually just love you for you if you choose to do ministry out of the person you are. And I like, even in this last week, actually had this as a bit of a revelation for my own ministry, which is that the more I do ministry for them to what I think they want, the more they actually are anxious and insecure about my role. But the more I do ministry, I describe this to someone as drummers who are in the pocket, which is that phrase of like a drummer who's just like really in the spot. It's just like really, really. And when you're in your pocket in ministry, I think people just like love you for who you are. And pretty much forgive you for your failings. And for the most part, the gender stuff, no matter how conservative or liberal or in between a person is when you first come to the call, that stuff stops to disappear, because the longer you've been there, you've been in their households, you've been to the hospital, you've buried their loved ones, you've baptized their kids, and you've proclaimed blessings and served them communion. Those symbols override all of our assumptions about roles.
Well said. So you mentioned the pandemic. Let's talk a little bit about that. How is that impacting your congregation, the two of you? What have you all been doing, and what do you see in the near future?
Our resting pulse as a people, and therefore as a congregation and as ministers, is more anxious, more stressed, more angry, more afraid, I think, than ever, and therefore more polarized. Though I think the polarization is a symptom of a deeper problem. It's not the problem, it's a symptom of a deeper problem, which is shame or unforgiveness or something like that. We're worshiping in person now, and probably one of the best experiences Lara and I have had working with a committee of people. We formed a coronavirus response team, has been making those decisions, and deeply theological decisions where you're having to decide against the pressure to open and safety, and what is being the body of Christ right now? Is that Wi-Fi? It's straining us to interpret in ways that we never have before. And that's unbelievably fatiguing and tiring, and at once also I think can be really creative. We're doing a Vespers service on Wednesday nights out in our courtyard. And I would say it's one of the things I'm most proud of that we've done in our time at First Pres. It arose out of our sense that the world is loud and the news is full, and people need to be still. And so we opened up our courtyard. We have a different musician from town, cellists, violinists, guitarists. People don't get to hear live music anymore. And so people come and they sit with their masks on, socially distanced, outside the sanctuary in the courtyard. They hear the sound of the fountain, remember their baptism, and they just sit together for a half hour, listen to prayer and poetry and scripture. And that time has been deeply healing. And it represents the contemplative side of Christian tradition that mainliners sometimes grasp toward, but we don't fully enter always. And that's been a huge gift.
Well, I think the pandemic has just, I joke that we're both young. I'm turning 30 next week. I think the pandemic will give me my first gray hairs, and I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to some proof that we have lived through this. But it's been interesting. I mean, early on, I think we saw our roles as just keeping our hands on the wheel and trying to steady this thing in turbulence. And immediate crisis response. But then, after a month, 6 weeks, can anyone believe how scared we all were mid-March? But, 6 weeks in, we start to realize, this is not, we're back before Pentecost. This is buckle up for a couple years here. And so we had to shift both with our staff and our elders. Okay, how are we going to figure this out over the long term and still do ministry that isn't constantly crisis response, because that's just exhausting, and we can't burn ourselves out by July because we are going to be needed in the fall. But with the coronavirus response team, it's been so helpful to have this group. It's 5 people representing 5 different committees of the church. But oh my goodness, God has just put the right people together to care for and lead our church. And our church, I think one of the greatest blessings of this whole pandemic has been the fact that our church has been so faithful and patient through the whole thing. Like, yes, there's some people in August who are getting really crabby that we're not open in person yet. But overall, people are understanding and they're grateful. The gratitude coming out of our congregation really astounds me. We wondered, are we going to have a ton of people for when we first open? And that is not the case. It's really quite small. Some people don't feel safe yet. Some people don't want to follow all of the safety measures and would rather just sing their heart out at home. So then you've got the middle. But I think the gift we're offering to people is the chance to be in a sacred space, and to sit and at least have community around them, though they're spaced out and they're masked. We're giving that opportunity to people, and I think it is really meaningful for them. One cool thing about the Vesper service, too, we started that around the same time, is that our oldest members are coming to that. So they feel safe enough to come out, because we've got tape all over the courtyard saying where you can sit and all of that. So that is really beautiful. And in August, I was feeling like, and I'm sure many other pastors were feeling like, the pandemic has taken away all of the best parts of being a pastor and left us with the worst parts.
You did not go to seminary to, record sermons and put them on the internet. Yeah.
No. And, sermons, you look for the people's faces, and sometimes, when I'm at my best, I riff because I can see confusion, or I can see that they want me to go further in something, and you don't get any of that when you're looking at a camera. But getting just these little things back of in person, it is a huge blessing to us. And the first Vespers I led, and it was our first on-campus in-person thing since March. And at the very end, I had them, Josh started this our first week. He just went for it. I think it was the second week we came to First Pres Salisbury. For the benediction, he invited people to extend their hands to receive it. And he did it, I think, on the fly. Like, we did not talk about making this change in worship.
So you're going, okay.
I hope this works. But the church loves it. So for the first Vespers, I had them stand and extend their hands, and I got choked up just seeing how quickly they popped up and reached out their hands to receive a blessing. So I think this pandemic time, it has been hard, but I think it's helped us to really relish in the places where there are blessings, and God's presence and spiritual growth. I mean, we can't pretend that the results we're looking for are just attendance at programs anymore. Really, the thing we have to focus on is, are people growing spiritually? And is that good enough for us? And for these two pastors, it really is.
On our good days.
On our best days, yeah.
Gosh, this has been fascinating. Are there any other things that you would like to say about the joys and the blessings and the challenges and the curses of being a clergy couple?
I have one. This is my axe I like to grind. I like to tell people that when people say, "Oh, clergy coupling, it's so new," and I like to say, "Well, it's as old as Priscilla and Aquila. It's been in our tradition for forever, and when women weren't allowed to be ordained, I'm sure there are lots of women who have felt a calling to ministry and did that as a pastor's wife over the years, lived that out in a really powerful and important way. And I think it all stems back, and this is the thing I love to talk about, I think it all stems back to the Trinity, persons in partnership and mutuality. And I think that is the thing I find the most fun about being a co-pastor, is that we get to show people it doesn't always have to be a pyramid of hierarchy. You can have partnership, and you can actually find consensus. You don't always have to have one person who's going to make the final decision. And it really is beautiful. And I hope it's a model to our church about how we can lead together, and to even couples in our church about how they can be partners together. So to me, I especially the next generation and these kids who are growing up seeing a woman pastor in partnership in their marriage, in their pastor's marriage, that they just assume, oh, that's normal, and I can expect that for my future. I think that has really important effects on people's lives, and so it brings me a lot of joy.
Josh, if you can top that.
I don't think I can. That's a good axe to grind, by the way, Lara.
Make that as sharp as you can make it.
Okay.
I think the only other thing I would say is the blessing / curse of co-pastoring is it like not being an individual but getting married changes your identity. Choosing to be a clergy couple changes your calling, and it weaves together me and Lara's calling, and we are still our own. I mean, the incarnation is kind of the other thing, it's like fully Josh, fully Lara, but joined fully also 100, 100, 100. And that's really wonderful because it brings out things you would have missed in it. But it's hard because as individuals, we may have gotten easier, bigger callings, bigger churches or something, and that would have been whatever. But what we get is ministry together, and I think it's sweeter. We're sweeter for it. Joining together our callings and our vocations. For me, it's meant seeing myself and my own understanding of my life before God far differently than would have been the case if I had just launched into it on my own.
Yeah. I have known Josh and Lara for a few years now, but this is the first time I've gotten to spend some time with them in conversation. And as you can see, they are a remarkably intelligent and gifted couple with an extraordinary amount of maturity for their ages. I am sure I was not spiritually mature enough at the age of 30 to pastor a 700-member congregation and lead a staff as large as theirs. I hope you've enjoyed this two-part journey into the lives of two very special clergy couples. And if you have, will you do me a favor and share this podcast with your friends and professional contacts? I also want to remind you that Pastors for Pastors is now in both audio and video formats. Our audio podcast continues on all major podcast providers, including the new Amazon podcast platform. And now we have added a YouTube channel with the same title, Pastors for Pastors. That's the word pastors, the number 4, and then the word pastors. I hope you'll check that channel out, subscribe, and leave some positive feedback. Thanks again for joining us. Until next time, I'm Ken Broman, folks, and this is Pastors for Pastors.